Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I know it can be hard to hear over the rustling of the sandwiches, but please feel free to keep eating. We're a family here, and so please enjoy your lunch as we continue. My name is Carrie Priest, and I'm an associate professor here in the Staley School of Leadership Studies, and I'm currently serving as the chair of this speaker series. So on behalf of our committee, many of whom are here today, if you're on the committee, would you wave your hand, please? Thank you. We would like to welcome you to What Matters to Me and Why. Thank you also to those who are joining us by Zoom. Hello and welcome. Today's talk is sponsored by the Dow Center for Multicultural and Community Studies at the K-State Libraries and the College of Arts and Sciences Diversity Committee. Our series is also sponsored and supported by the Staley School of Leadership Studies, the College of Education, and the College of Architecture, Planning, and Design. When this series began nearly 2 years ago, it was designed for this right here. It was designed for those of us who study, teach, learn, and work together daily to gather and to pause in the midst of our busy semester, our projects, our meetings, our classes, the list goes on, to pause to eat together, to create a space in which we can reflect on what matters most to our campus and community colleagues. Because affirming and celebrating our many different perspectives and journeys is how we embrace and enact our shared values and our principles of community. When we learn to tell our own story, when we hear and seek to understand others' stories, and when we embrace our shared story, we create pathways to positive change and a more just community and society. And as our speaker today shares his story, we will all be challenged to consider our own role and responsibility in creating that kind of change. But first, to introduce our speaker is Miranda Moore. Miranda is a senior in communication studies and political science pre-law with a leadership studies minor. She was raised in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and plans to work in Washington, D.C. following her graduation this spring. Congratulations in advance. And she is currently serving as K-State's Student Government Chief of Staff. Miranda.
Afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see a full house here today and lots of smiling faces as lunch sits in front of you. This afternoon's speaker, who came to us at Kansas State University just this past August, has been working in the world of higher education now for 3 decades. After receiving his bachelor's degree from East Tennessee State University and then a master's and doctorate in political science from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, he moved to New York and became an instructor at Stony Brook University. Over his many years of service at Stony Brook, he served in an array of professorial and administrative positions and earned many awards with over 50 scholarly publications in his name. Most notably, he received the Paul Lazarsfeld Outstanding Paper Award for the American Political Science Association in 2000 for discussing causes of bias in political reasoning. His book, The Rationalizing Voter, co-authored with Milton Lodge, has won multiple awards as well, including the Robert E. Lane Book Award for publications within political psychology. In 2013, he became the Vice Provost for Graduate and Professional Education and the Dean of Graduate School at the Stony Brook University before moving to Kansas. Since his arrival, he has made student voices a priority. He sat down with SGA leadership within the first few weeks of coming onto campus, a time when, as you know, he was very much in high demand, to get to know each of us and become familiar with the shared governance structure of our university. Throughout this year, he has remained committed to always being willing to sit down and talk through ideas, something I have experienced myself with an issue close to my heart here at K-State, academic advising. He recognizes the value students bring to decision-making, which is why I'm excited to have the opportunity to learn from him today about the role we as individuals and a university play in creating a just society. And I'm honored to introduce this lecture on personal responsibility for social justice. Please join me in welcoming Provost Charles Tabor.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Miranda. Good afternoon, everybody. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I don't think I've had a chance since I've been here to really talk in a personal way about things that are important to me personally. I've spent a lot of time talking about things that are important to the university and you know, the initiatives that we're doing here at the university. But really, I take this this opportunity today to really talk to you about something that has been important to me since I was really quite young. And that is, what sort of responsibility do individual people have for social justice? Now, how do I advance? Oh, a clicker's right here. A clicker was right there. Okay. Okay, so as some of you know, I grew up in West Africa, and one of the things that experience did for me is that it exposed me to the tremendous inequality that exists in the developing world. And there was really a moment of epiphany for me when I was about 10. I was living in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. And there's a hotel there called the Hotel Ivoire, which you see here. This is actually, when I was there, it was only about 7 or 8 years old. And it was at that time the tallest building on the continent of Africa. It is a palatial hotel. It's actually been remodeled recently since this picture was taken. And I didn't take this picture. This is taken off of Google. But I wanted you to get a sense of what the hotel looked like. In the grounds of this hotel, there's a multi-acre pool. It's an artificial lagoon. In the basement of this hotel is a bowling alley and an ice skating rink in the middle of equatorial Africa. Okay. Less than a half a mile from that hotel is an area of Abidjan known as Trècheville. This part of Abidjan is, like many developing cities, is a place where many people have come from across the country and really from all over West Africa trying to find opportunity in the city. And these people live really decades, in many cases their entire lives, in utter squalor. It is almost in the shadow of the Hotel Ivoire. So as a 10-year-old, I had a conversation with my mother about how this could be. How could people live in such opulence right next door to people who are living with nothing? Okay, and this sort of this conversation animated a lot of the thinking that I had over the coming decades about what it is that we should do as individuals to address the kind of inequality that exists in the world. I also became interested, not so much at 10, but you know, by the time I was a teenager, in issues about the connections between inequality, economic and social inequality, power inequality, and instability and conflict. You know, I lived until I was 16 in countries of West Africa, and I lived through 6 coups in that time. I experienced a lot of instability. I saw a lot of unrest, a lot of rioting and the like. So I became quite interested in it, and that became one of the things that drew me into the social sciences, and was in the early part of my research career. It was one of the things I focused on, trying to draw the link between political and economic inequality and unrest. So again, the question that I really want to talk with you today is, what is my responsibility? And it's a personal reflection, but I do think that there are some lessons that I'll draw towards the end about what is the role of a university in this area. By the way, I hope everybody has a piece of paper. We'll need it later. Just hold on to it for now. Okay. In this talk today, again, it's going to be a personal reflection, but I'm going to take you through the progression of my thinking. Okay, and this is this is going to be a somewhat sanitized version. That is, it's a much more logical and coherent presentation of the way in which I arrived at my conclusions than in fact happened. Okay, but I think that this is still a fair depiction of the sort of thinking that I engaged in over a period of decades to develop the way that I now view personal responsibility. So I want to start and by the way, this is not a lecture in moral philosophy. I'm not a moral philosopher, but I will be talking about issues that many moral philosophers have spent a lot of time talking about and writing about, things that I encountered later when I went to college and graduate school. And some of them were quite important to the way that I ended up thinking. But I'm not going to give you citations. I'm not going to give you sources here. So I want to start with the question about what is social justice. Okay, social justice refers to the idea that we should have fair, equitable, unbiased distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges in society. Okay, that we should have fair, equitable distribution. It's the foundational goal of a principle of political thought known as egalitarianism. Okay? By contrast, in modern political theory, there's a notion of individualism, which says that this is the belief that rewards should accrue unequally to people based on their individual work and achievement. And there are group extensions that you can make to individualism about how rewards should accrue to groups based upon their work and achievement. Now, individualism, and I don't have a quibble with individualism per se. That is, it's the basis for any sort of meritocracy. It's the basis for example, grading in courses. It's not something that I quibble with per se, but I think that there is a darker, sort of more judgmental side to individualism that has become quite important. Okay, this is a point of view that I will call deservingness. Okay, this is the notion that people get what they deserve. Okay, people get what they deserve. Okay. But do the people living in Treshville deserve their lot in life? That's a question I would pose to you. Is it a moral indictment to be poor? This is where I believe that modern views of individualism have gone wrong, okay, in turning to a judgment of individual worth based upon individual measures of success or achievement, okay? Now, a different view of individualism exists within political philosophy that I think is quite important and quite interesting, which emphasizes the rights and dignities of all individuals within a just social order. Okay, that notion of individualism is clearly fully compatible with egalitarianism. And in fact, even the less extreme version of individualism that simply says that rewards may be unequally distributed based upon different levels of work or performance, that notion is also consistent with egalitarianism. It is when you take the extra step of blaming people for outcomes, okay, that you've gone too far with individualism, in my view. So for me, social justice would be a condition of the world in which wealth, opportunities, and privileges are distributed fairly without biases. It's an ideal toward which I think we should strive. It's never been achieved, perhaps never will be achieved, given our human flaws and our natural biases. But it is an ideal that I believe we should aspire to. To quote Helen Keller, "Until the great mass of people shall be filled with the sense of responsibility for each other's welfare, social justice can never be attained." So that is really, to me, the call to action here. That is that individual people, the mass of individual people, need to be filled with a sense of responsibility for each other's welfare. Okay. So I want to turn now to a discussion of responsibility, the other part of this notion of personal responsibility for social welfare. Now, there's a lot of confusion, I think, in the way we think about responsibility. And a lot of this confusion is based on the fact that we use the word responsibility in a number of different ways. Let me point out 3 different ways that we use responsibility. Perhaps the most common way is we talk about individual responsibility for one's own actions, accountability. Okay, a legal definition of responsibility typically talks about the accountability one has for one's own actions. Okay. A second notion is individuals can be responsible for the actions of others under certain circumstances. Notions like sins of the father or guilt by association, these are all sort of ideas about how people can have some responsibility for others, and I'll elaborate on that a little later. The third responsibility that I'm going to focus on is collective or social responsibility. These are responsibilities that we have for the state of society. So the first of these ideas, the legal or individual moral responsibility, focuses on the accountability for personal actions. It's retrospective. That is, you do something and you're held accountable for it after the fact. Okay? You do something, it has consequences, and you have responsibility for those consequences. Okay? You are asserting in that the individual who behaves is the singular causal agent to the outcome. And there's an issue there because in almost all circumstances, there are multiple causes for outcomes. And so it is important, even when thinking, and this is part of what lawyers argue about in court cases, is trying to discern the degree to which there's an individual causal impact. This is how we assign blame or praise, punishment or reward. And it also rests upon a notion that behavior is based upon free will and intention. That is, I intend something, I do it, therefore I am accountable for it and for the outcomes that come from it. Okay? But we have to be careful in making those assertions because I am almost certainly not the only causal factor in the outcomes for which I may be blamed or rewarded. Okay? I also point out that it is an extension of this personal notion of accountability that I believe is responsible for the deservingness extension of individualism, that people get what they deserve. Okay? It's an extension. It is the observation that the condition of life you're in, say poverty, is the consequence for which individuals, poor people, are responsible. Okay? So I will assert that connection of an individual legal sense of retrospective responsibility is responsible, is the reason why we so often worry about whether it is in fact morally okay for whether people are morally responsible for their condition in life. The second definition is more problematic to most people. This asks the question, do we ever bear responsibility for the actions of others? Are we responsible for what our friends do? Are we responsible for what our family does? Are we responsible for what groups that we belong to do? Okay? Are we responsible for the nations that we're members of, for what they do? Think of a group. If you belong to an exclusive social club, for example, what's your responsibility? Is there any responsibility for discrimination in that social club because of membership in that club? A major sort of moral question that many Germans grappled with after the Second World War was the degree to which Germans in general felt responsibility for the actions of Nazis. And the last point I'd make here is, are people responsible for the behaviors of ancestors? This is something that we've debated a lot. I remember clearly in college having debates with people about whether there is any responsibility for a generation now for the behavior of their ancestors, what people did in the past. So I would say, personal response, that we do bear some responsibility for the behavior of others to the extent that we support or condone their behavior, and to the extent that we benefit from that behavior. Okay? So in the question about ancestors, if in the extreme case of this, if I support or condone the behavior of those ancestors, and I've benefited from what they did in the past, I believe I have some responsibility in that case. So rich descendants of a robber baron. Okay. In my mind, there is responsibility there. There is responsibility to try to redress some of the inequities developed from that came from that. But I want to focus actually on the third form of responsibility, which I think is more interesting in this question, the collective notion of responsibility. So by contrast with the other two, this is a prospective view of responsibility. That is, it's looking forward. It's saying that individuals should follow a moral code that's focused on improving future states of the world. Okay? And that's what I became more interested in in thinking through these things. That is, I believe that without concern for my own individual gain, or for persons without concern for their own individual gain, people should have a concern about what the future will look like for their community. Okay. If one lives in an unjust society, and I believe all societies are unjust, the question is there a responsibility as a member of a community to work for social justice within that community? So if you observe that there's unequal distribution within that community that is based upon unfair or biased processes, do you have a responsibility as a member of that community to try to create a better future, to try to improve that? And my answer to that is yes. For me, personal responsibility for social justice means that individuals should follow a moral code that will move us closer to the ideal condition of fair and just distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges. So I want to go through now some motivating forces for my point of view, okay, and then talk a bit about some of the impediments to my point of view. First, some of the things that I think promote a personal responsibility for social justice are adherence to egalitarianism as an ideological principle. So you could support this as an ideological point, okay? Many people might support, and these are not exclusive, and this will not be an exhaustive list, but these are the things that I think are most important. I think many people arrive at this point of view through some form of sympathy, empathy, compassion, perhaps in some cases even pity, okay? So that's another avenue into this notion that an individual should have responsibility for redressing issues of injustice. A third avenue here is duty, responsibility to others. Okay, and that is more directly related to the collective responsibility notion that I was just talking about. I'll also just point out that in many religious traditions, I grew up in Christianity, that this sort of sense of responsibility for others is part of the duty of behavior within that tradition. A fourth avenue is an understanding of reciprocity and mutual accountability. That is, we live in networks of human beings. So what goes around comes around. Okay, so economists can argue that we can develop cooperative behavior through concerns about reciprocity. Okay. There are also potentially evolutionary reasons for cooperation in community. There's been some of you may know this better than I do, but there's some quite interesting work done on the value of groups to survival, and therefore the importance of maintaining groups, group cohesion. So at least in developing sort of a functional working group, the ability to hold people accountable within that group, and the ability to put the group or community above oneself. And that it can be important in an evolutionary sense. Another possibility is actually one of the first that hit me as a young teen is the simple notion that instability is caused by inequality. And so there's sort of a very practical connection there, that if we want to live in a stable environment, we had better address the root causes of the instability. And finally, I would argue that there are actually some self-interest reasons for this. Just very quickly, some of those. In an unequal distribution, we're actually making very inefficient use, I'll talk it like an economist, making very inefficient use of talent, okay? It's an awful lot of brain power that's not being used when half of society, women, a little more than half, are not given the same access. When people of color, for example, or people whose gender orientation or transgender people are not given this, these are talented people, and we're losing the opportunity of their inputs into the solutions that we could have to basic problems. So I think there's a self-interest. There are other self-interest arguments we could make beyond talent, but I'll stop there. Now let me turn to the other side. What are some of the real problems here? So the responsibility for social justice, I think, is undermined by many things, okay? Individualism, and in particular, the more extreme notion that I've been calling deservingness, okay? I think that those undermine a support for social justice. For many people, indifference or apathy, okay? That it's not my problem. For some, cruelty. That is, there are certainly some reasons. I have known people in my life who take pleasure in the suffering of others. I think this next one is actually quite important in the current political situation. I think we have a lot of resentments that are felt based upon social mobility and the economic or social threat that comes with increased social mobility. That is, that as there's mobility across these barriers in society, that poses potential threats to the interests of people who are already in higher levels within this hierarchy. Rationalization and excuses. I've spent a lot of my career actually studying the ways in which we rationalize. That's one of the key features of my research. And I think that we're really adept. We are really machines for rationalization, humans. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think it's really quite powerful. Group competition over scarce resources. Okay, so again, moving to a more of an economic point of view here, the world has limited resources, scarce resources. So there is simply group competition for control of those resources. Stable power hierarchies. So once you have power hierarchies, there is a stability to that hierarchy. It is itself a sort of a self-enforcing mechanism. And finally, self-interest. I had self-interest on the other list as well, but personal and immediate self-interest is very much an impediment to seeing the value of working for social justice. So one of the most important parts of this is that people inhabit different parts of the unequal distribution, okay? And we have a notion that I know you're all familiar with, privilege, which talks about the benefits that arise for people who are in positions within that hierarchy that give them access to things that other people do not. I want to do a simple exercise here, and it's in fact probably simplistic, but it's something that I do in classrooms. So I'm going to ask you to take your piece of paper and wad it up. Make a ball. Make a ball out of your piece of paper. Okay. This room is the land of opportunity. Okay. You are all members of our social stratified society, and you are all going to take a shot at the good life. Okay? You're going to take your opportunity to move into the highest level of wealth and status, and that's represented by this trash can down here. Okay? If you can get your crumpled piece of paper into the trash can, I assure you, you will have wealth beyond measure and success. Let's try it. No. That was great. That was excellent. Let's do it. Try it. I want you to see if you can get it in there. Somebody in this building is going to be mad at me for this. Okay. So, I mean, this is a simple exercise designed to demonstrate the differences in opportunity that come with different levels of privilege. And we had a very clever, well, I'll call that social mobility. But unless I missed something, I think the only crumpled balls that went into that came from the first row. I think there was one that came from this first row, one that came from right here. I didn't notice any coming from rows further back, okay? Now, when I do this in a classroom, you know, we would then have an extended discussion about how fair people thought this was, and people usually in the back volunteer how unfair this is. People in the front are usually not as enthusiastic about the discussion about how unfair it is. Who will be most aware of privilege in the room? Those in the back, right? So I guess I'm sorry, the people on Zoom wow, yeah. The people on Zoom are in Treshville, I'm afraid. So another question, is this privilege that you had in here earned in any way or deserved? I guess in some sense, if you got here early and came in the door early and sat down, you know, you got your spot early, maybe you could say you earned the spot, but you didn't know we were going to do this. You didn't know there was a competition for fabulous wealth today. So you know, it's probably fairest to say that it's not deserved or earned in any particular way. What if we had seated people in this room by some sort of arbitrary criteria before this? What if, for example, we'd said that all people whose skin color was a shade darker than something I could hold up sit in the back, and all people who are, you know, lighter skinned sit in the front? What if we divided men or women in the room and they played this game? Not that this game has any real consequences, but in the real world, the game has real consequences. So I guess the point I want to make is that privilege is often unnoticed by the people that hold it, okay? And it's actually determinative of outcomes in many cases. Okay. So it's important that we recognize the privilege. It's very easy to rationalize privilege. It's very easy to see injustice as other people's problem. Okay, it's the people in the back's problem that they couldn't reach the trash can when they threw. So I think, and for me, an important lesson, I obviously didn't do this exercise as a kid, but in thinking through these things, an important lesson is that all people have responsibility to work towards social justice, but my responsibility is greater than many because of the privilege I hold. That's how I feel about it. I have been very privileged. I didn't grow up in a wealthy family, but I grew up in a family where we never wanted for anything that we actually needed. The people in Treshville want for something every single day. I grew up in a stable family with two parents. both of whom were engaged in supporting me and my four sisters, and were completely committed to our success. There are lots of other ways I could speak about the privilege that I've had, but I'm in the front row. So I believe that people with that kind of privilege have an extra responsibility. Okay, and I want to be careful about one part of that. I've mentioned, several of you know that my daughter, who's a college student, is very active on her campus in a number of different socially active groups. And she says, "Dad, be careful about this because you're an ally and you should not take over social movements." So one of the points I do want to make here is that while I have greater responsibility to support social justice, that does not mean that I should step in and control movements for social justice. Okay, and I should lend my voice and support, and that's my view about it at any rate. Okay, so let me turn in the last few minutes before we open up for conversation to the question about what should universities do. We are at a university, and I'm not just an individual, I'm the provost of the university. So I do have some thoughts about the roles that universities can play in promoting social justice. And actually, before I go there, I should say something. I'm a political scientist, you know that, so I should say something about, I don't view this topic as political, but I know many others do, okay? The family that I grew up in was politically very conservative. But I have to tell you, my parents completely supported social justice. They were missionaries. That's what they were doing, okay? So I don't see a necessary relationship between politics, although when you get to the point of talking about government roles, it's at that point that it becomes a very political discussion. I'm not going to talk about that today. I do have opinions, but I'm not going to talk about the role of government. But I want to say a few things about universities. So some things that I think we should be doing or can do, and some things I know many of you are doing, okay? We should be modeling social justice on universities. If you think about just societies and the equitable distribution within just societies as an ideal to aspire to, I believe universities typically are and certainly should be further along the dial towards that ideal than the communities that we come from. Okay, and I think that that's important for us to maintain, that we model social justice. Second, I think we need to model civil discourse and respect for multiple points of view. Everything I've presented today is my point of view. I've talked about my personal opinions here, okay? I love to talk to people who disagree with me. It actually is true. I love to talk to people who disagree with me. Those Thanksgiving dinners with my brothers-in-law who are completely different in their orientation from me is something I really enjoy. And not because I see it as a battle to win, but because it's really interesting to talk to people with whom I completely disagree. And universities have to be open to all points of view. So respectful civil discourse to compare and talk about multiple points of view. Third, we should be broadening perspectives. That's a lot of what we do at universities. We're broadening perspectives of students, but ourselves as well, through this direct communication that we have here on campus. People come here with limited backgrounds. All of us come here with limitations in our backgrounds. And universities are a place where lots of people come together from different backgrounds. And so that, what we call courageous conversations, I know a lot of that goes on here, is so important because it's exposing people to not just different points of view, but people with different backgrounds, people who are fundamentally different from them, okay? Third, I think that we are and should be important engines of social mobility through the opportunities that we provide. And this is where I think it's so important that we have things like need-based aid. It's very important that we are providing broad opportunities to our community. I mean, when you look back at the development of the public university system, starting with land grants, and we're, of course, the first land grant. So, if anything should be in our DNA, it should be the idea of easy access for members of our community, providing opportunities for all members of our community. And that's a social mobilizing force. And but if you read the original legislation for land grants, it's written right in there about how the land grant universities are to be opportunities for people within the states, within their communities, to move up. Promoting individual development, growth, and success. I mean, that's student success, but also, of course, even our own. We need to be promoting individual development and growth. And that's, again, going to be a mobilizing force, an empowering force. Teaching the skills of critical thinking and self-awareness. We talk about that a lot, but, it's so true. Where else do people get really critical thinking skills? Okay, and to the degree to which we move away from universities and towards other forms of education that don't have any liberal component in them, I think we're missing out a bit on some of what students can get at a university or a college where they have general education courses. They have a broad variety of exposure to a broad variety of things that promotes critical thinking skills, self-awareness. Within that kind of an environment, you can develop your own beliefs, and they'll be solid and they'll be true to you. And I also believe it's important at universities, and I've done this for my whole career, that we have research and teaching that explores the issues of individualism, egalitarianism, the implications for social justice. These need to be things that we do, knowledge that we produce at universities. So, to conclude, what is important to me and why? I feel, just personally, a deep commitment to promote social justice in my daily life. And I accept that responsibility to promote that from the position of privilege. And I think that that's something that I would like to, I hope that I am an example in doing that for others. I also think that I would like to encourage an educational environment that respects individual differences, emphasizes the development of critical thinking skills and reflection. So why? It's morally right. That's kind of a good reason, I think. But second, also, I really believe that human progress depends on improving social justice. I think that we won't be able to solve the worst problems that we have without having more people at the table, more ideas, more creative thinkers. So I'm going to leave you with a final thought, and then I would love to talk with you. This is a quote from Desmond Tutu. It's another one of the quotes that I like very much. He says, "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity with the oppression." Questions, thoughts?
Great. We're going to entertain some questions, but we do ask that you would wait for the microphone so that our guests on Zoom can hear what your questions are.
I appreciated your thoughtful perspective, so thank you for that. One of the very troubling things for many of us in the United States in 2018 is the variable view of who matters and who doesn't matter. And can you talk about how we can change people's perception of who matters, especially through the university?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my own experience, at least, and some of the research I've done, suggests that it's almost a losing battle to simply try to tell people they're wrong and provide, argue. Okay, so I think that the best thing to do, my own view, is that it's best to draw people into conversation, create a dialogue that respects a view that you disagree with, and then through that conversation, I think you can start to build some bridges. And in terms of broadening the view of who matters, I think that the best evidence to bring to bear on that is just by showing so many examples of people who matter from lots of different backgrounds and groups, the impacts that we've had from lots of different people and groups. There's so much success to point to. And so when certain groups and people are dismissed, it's almost always easy to find examples of why they shouldn't be dismissed. I think it has to be couched, and within that respectful conversation where you're not just faking it, but you're genuinely interested in the point of view of the person with whom you disagree.
I have a question from a Zoom participant. Provost Tabor, how would you objectively measure social justice efforts at K-State?
Well, so first of all, I don't think that I can fully objectively measure that. But I do think that there are things that we can do to assess how well we're doing. So, for example, we have a variety of metrics that we can look at. Graduation rates, which measures, the sort of the grossest measure of student success. And when you look at that, it's disconcerting. You look at the differences across groups on campus for students, and you find that, African Americans are leaving the university before completion. So I think that's one area, I'm a data-based social scientist, so my first answer to these things is always data. But I think there's also, some important things that we should be doing and are doing in promoting the kinds of conversations I talked about earlier, and that through those conversations we can get a better sense of where we are. I'll give one example. I had a really interesting conversation with some members of our LGBTQ community. Probably within the first month I was here. And you know what? There was from that group, and I've heard it from several others, there was a sense that we're not doing as well as we should be doing. We have a wonderful community at K-State and a great sense of connection to that community, but do all members of our community feel part of that? And I'm not sure that they do. And I think through conversation, we can start to pull some of that out.
I get a mic to work.
Yes.
They didn't teach me that when I got my PhD, how to work a mic. So how do we deal with, I had this conversation for targeting without stigmatizing.
Mm.
We know, like in our graduation rate, there are certain groups that do very poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't target that group, we try to target the general, we're not really bringing those numbers up.
Yeah.
And if you target that group and you get a kickback because you can't target because there's bias to target, how would you address that?
Well, in the area of student success, I don't think that it is at all biased to identify measures of students at risk and then target those students at risk with interventions. Universities do that all over the place. I'm sure we do it in many ways. So I don't think that's a violation, but I think it becomes a much more difficult conversation when you're talking about admission and things like that. And we cannot legally admit based upon categories, as I was saying before. And yet, what we really need to do is to make sure that we don't have barriers, okay? And then create opportunities that are broad enough that we are benefiting all people. So, poor people have tremendous difficulty in being successful at universities, partly because of their financial difficulties, and partly because of lesser preparation. They're typically receiving less preparation prior to coming to universities. We have to be doing so much more, and we are planning to do so much more as we have resources for need-based financial aid. I think that's going to be critically important and help in terms of admission for lots of groups of students out there.
Provost Tabor, here.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. I was just curious, you mentioned your parents being missionaries, and that's how you ended up in Africa.
Yes.
What role do you feel your parents as missionaries played in you discovering your privilege?
Oh, well, listen, we couldn't be privileged with my mom. Or I should say she knew our privilege and smacked us around for it. Not in any, I don't mean that in a violent way. My parents, you know, were really, really important to the development of all four of my sisters and I. And they were remarkable in the way that they held honest and open conversations about everything with us from very early ages. And I've said earlier, they were fairly conservative, very conservative socially. They were extremely open and constructive in discussions. Now, through those kinds of discussions, it was hard to escape the privilege that we had. Okay, so I'll give you some examples. It may surprise you to know that American missionaries in places like Africa have household help. Okay, we had a houseboy, we had a gardener, we had nighttime guards who came and worked, not because my parents felt they needed any help, but because it was actually part of the local economy. And the $1 a day that was paid was really high wages for these people that worked in the house. But it's a weird thing for someone with a missionary background to sort of feel like you're living the colonial life, you know, and very uncomfortable in many ways. So we would have conversations with the people that worked with us. They eventually became basically family members. But when I remember when we arrived in Abidjan. So I was born in Central African Republic and then moved around. When we arrived in Abidjan, that was the first place where we had people working in our house. And my mom went nuts when she was told by the American Bible Society, which was the group my dad worked for. He was a Bible translator. The group that he worked for, they told us we had to hire people in the house. It was expected. We would offend the local community if we didn't, because we were wealthy Americans. We weren't wealthy, but we were very wealthy by their standards. And so that, again, I mean, really makes clear your privilege when you've got somebody washing your clothes and things like that. So.
So you talked about the original land grant purpose of K-State and how we're putting a focus on trying to get back to those standards of providing opportunities to our community, to people of all levels within our community. My question is, what is your view on balancing that mission with the ever important idea of creating a more globally focused student body in an ever globalizing world that we're going into?
I think they're very compatible. So I think so first of all, I view the community that we serve under our land grant mission as not just being the state of Kansas. The state of Kansas is obviously quite important. But beyond that, we serve the nation, we serve the world. So I think that, for example, recruiting international students enriches our campus and provides opportunities for everybody. And is not in any way in conflict with our land grant mission to do that. Now, I'm sure there are many folks that don't agree with that. I know, coming from New York, you think of New York as a liberal state. It's actually not. There's, a city in New York that's liberal, and the rest of the, so there's an upstate, downstate sort of conflict going on in the state of New York, and upstate politicians hated the fact that Stony Brook University recruited so many international students. I mean, it's almost 30% of the student body was international students at Stony Brook. And so it wasn't a land-grant university, though, but public university supported by New York taxpayer dollars. We certainly heard from lots of politicians about how that was not serving the mission of the university, the state university for the state of New York. I fundamentally don't agree with that position. So we would argue, we would show the benefits, and typically, by the way, we've, prevailed in those arguments.
Dr. Tabor,
Yeah.
I don't think this is working, so
Yes.
I'll project. Okay, now it's on.
You are.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you for your lecture today.
Mhm.
You've repeatedly talked about the importance of civil discourse and hearing all perspectives. And I would like to hear your thoughts on what that means when we have a campus population where for some students having civil discourse about what are considered to be controversial topics today
Mhm.
is merely an academic exercise, but for other students that can easily become a situation in which they have to defend their personhood from invalidation.
Yeah, and that's unacceptable. So yeah, I exactly. So when I'm talking about civil discourse, I am talking about discussion that does not challenge the identities of people, who people are. We can discuss what people think. We can't discuss who people are, in my view. Or we can't sort of challenge other people on who they are, okay? So I think that that's part of this is not an easy thing, but I think we have to find ways to foster conversation in which the discussion of points of view is about things that that are not existential for the participants. Does that make sense to you? Now, that's not much of an answer. I mean, how do we do that is the trick. But I think it's by helping people in the community to understand what are the kinds of conversations that we should be open to having, and what are the kinds of conversations that actually threaten the basic identity of people. Okay. This is something I talk with my daughter about all the time because this is an issue that she's very involved in on her college campus. What do you do as a university, for example, with outside speakers who would like to come in and talk about topics that are challenging the identities of people on your campus? There's free speech. There's hate speech. How do you dance among those things? I'm not giving answers. I'm just saying these are things we have to come to grips with if we're going to be successful in having the kind of campus that I want us to have.
I think we have time for one more, and I have another Zoom participant. Provost Tabor, thank you for sharing your story. You mentioned your conversations with members of our LGBT community.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to students that feel marginalized because they feel like they have no voice at the university? And I think this kind of goes along with the last question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's actually on the university that you have a voice. So I think that first of all, we need to be aware, and then we need to have conversations among those of us who are involved in promoting the climate on campus. I see Dr. Samuel here. There are a number of administrators in the room, and then there are lots of faculty and staff. We're all responsible for creating an environment in which people are heard. So if they're not heard, we need to hear about it. I mean, I remember at the KS Unite event, the only one I've been to, one just this year, some of the student stories that went up there were talking about this exact issue. And this is a celebration, and it's an appropriate celebration of progress. But it's also pointing to some of the distance that we still need to go on campus. So I would just tell students like that to continue to raise their voices and to try to make sure that people like me know about the struggles that they're having, and people like Brian Samuel and people like Amit Chakrabarty, and I don't know who else is in here who has that kind of university-wide responsibility. But I think that that's important.
for sharing your story, your perspectives. I believe we all leave here with a greater understanding of the work. There's much work to be done in the area of social justice, and it's all of our work. And so thank you for giving us some
We have a lot of
ideas.
cleanup to do too.
To help us with that. Again, have a great afternoon.